Once Upon a Time is a short story by Nadine Gordimer, who was born into a white family in South Africa at a time when apartheid was prevalent. Apartheid, as the word suggests, was a policy of discrimination or segregation based on what race you belonged to. She opposed this policy, and several of her works covered this. The government of South Africa banned her writings because they were against their policy of apartheid. Someone has written to ask me to contribute to an anthology of stories for children. I reply that I don't write children's stories. And he writes back that a recent Congress Book Fair seminar, a certain novelist said every writer ought to write at least one story for children. I think of sending a postcard saying I don't accept that I ought to write anything. And then last night I woke up, or rather was wakened without knowing what had roused me. A voice in the echo chamber of the subconscious? A sound. A creaking of the kind made by the weight carried by one foot after another along a wooden floor. I listened. I felt the apertures of my ears distend with concentration. Again, the creaking. I was waiting for it, waiting to hear if it indicated that feet were moving from room to room, coming up the passage to my door. So here, the author thinks that somebody has entered her house. And if you notice, you see the word waiting has been repeated twice. Now, repetition is a literary technique used by authors to create emphasis. And here, it was used to emphasize her fear. I have no burglar bars, no gun under the pillow, but I have the same fears as people who do take these precautions, and my windows are thin as rime. I could shatter like a wine glass. A woman was murdered, how do they put it, in broad daylight in a house 2 blocks away last year. And the fierce dogs who guarded an old widower and his collection of antique clocks were strangled before he was knifed by a casual laborer he had dismissed without pay. I was staring at the door, making it out in my mind rather than seeing it in the dark. I lay quite still, a victim already. But the arrhythmia of my heart was fleeing, knocking this way and that against its body cage. How finely tuned the senses are just out of rest, sleep. I could never listen intently as that in the distractions of the day. I was reading every faintest sound, identifying and classifying its possible threat. Now, these details show that the author has the same fears as the other white people in the neighborhood, even though she did not have extra security in her house. But I learned that I was to be neither threatened nor spared. There was no human weight pressing on the boards. The creaking was a buckling, an epicenter of stress. I was in it. The house that surrounds me while I sleep is built on undermined ground, far beneath my bed. The floor, the house's foundations, the stopes and passages of gold mines have hollowed the rock, and when some face trembles, detaches, and falls, 3,000 feet below, the whole house shifts slightly, bringing uneasy strain to the balance and counterbalance of brick, cement, wood, and glass that hold it as a structure around me. The misbeats of my heart tailed off like the last muffled flourishes on one of the wooden xylophones made by the Chopi and Songa, migrant miners who might have been down there, under me in the earth at that moment. The stope where the fall was could have been disused, dripping water from its ruptured veins. Or men might now be interred there in the most profound of tombs. I couldn't find a position in which my mind would let go of my body, release me to sleep again. So I began to tell myself a story, a bedtime story. So here we see that she realizes that there is no intruder in her house, and the sounds that she's been hearing are the sounds that are coming out from the mine that is under her house. Now, once that is out of the way, she wants to go back to sleep, but she can't. So she starts telling herself a story. In a house, in a suburb, in a city, there was a man and his wife who loved each other very much and were living happily ever after. They had a little boy and they loved him very much. They had a cat and a dog that the little boy loved very much. They had a car and a caravan trailer for holidays and a swimming pool which was fenced so that the little boy and his playmates would not fall in and drown. They had a housemaid who was absolutely trustworthy and an itinerant gardener who was highly recommended by the neighbors. For when they began to live happily ever after, they were warned by that wise old witch, the husband's mother, not to take on anyone off the street. They were inscribed in a medical benefit society. Their pet dog was licensed. They were insured against fire, flood damage, and theft, and subscribed to the local neighborhood watch, which supplied them with a plaque for their gates lettered, "You have been warned," over the silhouette of a would-be intruder. He was masked. It could not be said he was black or white, and therefore proved the property owner was no racist. So here, the author gives us the first example of foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is a clue that authors give their readers as to what will happen later in the story. So in this case, the swimming pool being fenced off so the boy doesn't drown in it is a clue of what may happen later to the boy. These phrases, "live happily ever after," "the wise old witch," are fairy tale elements, phrases that you find in fairy tales. And this last sentence about the silhouette of the figure on the plaque that is neither black nor white. Now, even though the plaque does not show the color of the intruder, it indirectly lets the reader know that the family were afraid of non-white intruders. So in a way, they were racist. It was not possible to insure the house, the swimming pool, or the car against riot damage. There were riots, but these were outside the city, where people of another color were quartered. These people were not allowed into the suburb except as reliable housemaids and gardeners. So there was nothing to fear, the husband told the wife. Yet she was afraid that someday such people might come up the street and tear off the plaque, "You have been warned," and open the gates and stream in. "Nonsense, my dear," said the husband. "There are police and soldiers and tear gas and guns to keep them away." But to please her, for he loved her very much, and buses were being burned, cars stoned, and school children shot by the police in those quarters out of sight and hearing of the suburb, he had electronically controlled gates fitted. Anyone who pulled off the sign, "You have been warned," and tried to open the gates would have to announce his intentions by pressing a button and speaking into a receiver relayed to the house. The little boy was fascinated by the device and used it as a walkie-talkie in Cops and Robbers played with his small friends. Now here, although they live in a peaceful suburb, the wife is still afraid of people of another color harming them. The husband reassures her, but installs additional security nevertheless, which shows us that he too had a little bit of fear inside him. Then this sentence of the little boy playing with the device that controlled the gates and using it as a walkie-talkie in Cops and Robbers is another example of foreshadowing that shows us that this very interest of his in these security devices will later lead to some kind of disaster. So we're going to stop here now, and I will continue this in part 2. Goodbye.